Hello everyone, this is Showtime 112. The New Guinea campaign was one of the longest and most well-known campaigns of the Second World War, beginning in early 1942. The Japanese on one side and the Americans and Australians on the other fought for control of one of the largest and most inhospitable islands in the world. The Japanese strategic objective in the South Pacific was to create a defensive perimeter in order to resist any Allied attempts to push Japan out of the captured territories in the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia. Furthermore, they sought to cut off Australia from the USA, thus preventing its use as a base for offensive operations. One way to achieve this was to advance through the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. The second was to capture Port Moresby, the only major settlement on Papua New Guinea. But before the New Guinea campaign even began, the Japanese wanted to capture a location which would serve as their main stronghold for both the New Guinea and the Solomons campaign, Rabaul on the island of New Britain. Just like the eastern half of New Guinea, New Britain and the nearby New Ireland were administered by Australia. The country's limited resources were the only thing that stood in the way of the determined Japanese offensive. Possession of locations such as Rabaul or Port Moresby was extremely important. Such places were almost like islands within larger islands, as due to the extremely difficult terrain and the lack of roads, they could only be reached easily by sea or by air, therefore making the entire campaign primarily an air war. But what kind of air power did the opposing sides in the region have at their disposal? The only proper combat aircraft available to the Australians were the Lockheed Hudson bomber and the consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat. In 1940, the Australians assigned only 8 aircraft for the defense of New Guinea. At the time, the country's efforts were focused on supporting Britain's war in Europe and Africa. As soon as the Pacific War began, estimates were raised to 11 squadrons needed to defend Rabaul and Port Moresby, but such a force could no longer be acquired. Only 13 Hudson bombers divided between 2 squadrons were available in Australia to cover the entire east coast. Catalina flying boats were available in similar numbers, and the type was likewise operated by 2 squadrons sharing 10 airframes between them. The RAAF had 40 trained crews for their Hudsons and only 15 trained crews for the Catalinas. This meant that the squadrons operating the flying boat could only provide an average of 4 to 6 sorties a day. You might have noticed that no fighters have been mentioned. In fact, the RAAF didn't have any in the region when the Pacific War broke out. The only thing remotely comparable to a fighter plane was the Wirraway. This Australian-produced aircraft based on the American NA-16 was primarily a trainer, with a secondary combat capability. With a top speed of only 220 miles per hour, about 350 kilometers per hour, and 2 303-inch caliber forward-firing machine guns, the Australian aircraft stood no chance against Japanese fighters. That, however, didn't stop its crews from trying. The Wirraways operated in 2 composite squadrons, 23 and 24, each consisting of 2 flights of Wirraways and 1 flight of Hudson bombers. The Lockheed Hudson represented a main strike element of the RAAF. The American twin-engine bomber was capable of reaching a speed of 246 miles per hour, or 396 kilometers per hour, and could carry 1,400 pounds, or 640 kilograms of bombs. Enemy fighters were kept at bay with 2 303-inch machine guns in a dorsal turret, while 2 more such weapons were located in the nose. The PBY Catalina flying boat was a patrol bomber, capable of extremely long patrols and of attacking enemy ships over large ocean areas. It could stay in the air for 23 hours with a 1,600 kilometers reconnaissance radius, while its bombing radius was 1,100 kilometers. Although the type carried defensive machine guns, The Australian Catalinas lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Installation of such fuel cells would have reduced the type's range by a quarter, and the RAAF rejected such a penalty. This meant that the Australian Catalinas were highly flammable and incapable of attacking anything but lightly defended targets. '24 Squadron RAAF was given the order to prepare its Hudson flight for deployment to Rabaul on 2nd of December 1941. 4 Hudsons, supported by 2 Empire flying boats, took off on the 5th, eventually arriving at Vunakanau airfield near Rabaul on the 7th. Vunakanau was a simple airstrip with no dispersals and no ground equipment. The lack of fuel tankers meant that it took 6 hours to refuel a single Hudson using hand pumps. Despite all this, pre-war doctrine suggested that a miniature force of 4 bombers could simply sink enemy ships, attack ground targets, and remain effective, regardless of opposition. 8th of December saw the first Japanese intrusion when an unidentified aircraft overflew Rabaul. The next day saw another such flight, and this time the intruder was identified as a twin-engine Japanese Navy aircraft. This was a G3M Nell based on truck. The Hudson flight commander, John Murphy, took off, attempting to intercept the Japanese aircraft, but even though he was an experienced Hudson pilot, he was unable to catch the Nell. When the Hudsons first arrived in Australia, they were seen as potential heavy air defense fighters, but this sortie shattered all such illusions. The Australian response was to deploy 23 Squadron's 2 Wirraway flights to Rabaul to perform intercept duties. Ironically, the Wirraway was even slower than the Hudson and had even worse chances of catching enemy aircraft. The first Wirraway flight arrived at Rabaul on 10th of December, sharing the Vunakanau airfield with the Hudsons. The second flight arrived 5 days later and was deployed to the old civilian airfield at Lakunai. At that time, the RAAF decided to launch its first offensive operation against the Japanese. The only target within the range of the 4 Hudsons at Rabaul was Kapinga Marangi, also known as Greenwich Island. This was a poorly defended Japanese outpost in the Caroline Islands. On 15th of December, a single Hudson flown by Flight Lieutenant Ken Irwin was sent on a reconnaissance mission after receiving intelligence reports of Japanese ship movements. Irwin's airplane arrived over Kapinga Marangi in mid-morning at 15,000 feet, finding 19 barges and 1 transport ship. Descending to inspect the ship, Irwin estimated its displacement at 5,000 tons and attracted some of its defensive fire. Following radio silence doctrine, the crew did not report their find, and the RAAF command could only learn of it after a 3-hour return flight. Unfortunately, the Hudson crew failed to wind the film onto the camera correctly, resulting in no available photos. In their defense, they had received no realistic camera training, and as the mission was flown at 15,000 feet, the lack of oxygen masks on the Hudsons likely caused hypoxia, which combined with their lack of experience resulted in the described outcome. 1.5 hours after Irwin's landing at 1:30 p.m., 3 Hudsons were launched on a strike mission. The bombers dispersed in a search pattern and found a Japanese ship about 60 miles from Kapinga Marangi, making separate attacks within a 50-minute period. The Hudsons attacked individually from between 7,000 and 10,000 feet, making the job of evasion easy for the Japanese ship's crew. Just as with the reconnaissance mission, the Hudson air crews were rebuked for their lack of results by Wing Commander Gehring, the 9 operational group commander. This clearly indicates the delusional ideas held at the time by command structures which completely misunderstood the effectiveness of attacks against ships. Goering in fact believed that the Hudson crews should have performed low-level attacks, completely ignoring the fact that no delayed bomb fuses were available to them. Attacking with impact fuses would have been deadly to the attackers, as they would have likely been damaged by their own bombs. This was the first part of our series covering the events leading to the New Guinea aerial campaign. As always, let us know how you liked the topic and keep watching Showtime 112.